It really gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this opening keynote controversy uh, panel discussion entitled Elections, Riots, Distrust, What's the State of Democracy? And as those of you who heard my opening remarks, you will know that the state of democracy is something that runs through as a theme of this festival. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas, and I suppose this is a scene setter for that idea that possibly democracy itself is feeling fragile and under strain, under pressure from all sides. We have they're all the same, what's the point in voting sentiment. We have a feeling of disenfranchisement as voting systems seem to exclude huge swathes of the electorate from representation. We have the way that the ballot box is no longer seen as the last word in an election, with losers' consent no longer given, a very dangerous trend that's occurred. We also have attempts all around Europe by some mainstream parties to do whatever it takes to isolate, discredit, even demonize, even ban electorally popular populist parties. And as we saw, whether relating to Brexit or the reaction to the summer riots, certain citizens are being shunned and labelled as being beyond democratic engagement. Now, I'm exaggerating some of these trends, but you will recognise them. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether democracy can survive all these kind of attacks. So, to calm me down, I hope, and reassure me, I've got a fabulous panel. For those of you who haven't been to the festival before, I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. They've been given a very strict 6 to 7 minutes each to answer all of those questions. And then after that, we'll be coming straight out to the audience. You'll be giving questions that will then allow the panel to interact with each other. So let me introduce this panel, and I'm really pleased to have them. First of all, we've got Luke Trill, who is the executive director of More in Common UK. He's one of the people, he's got it's kind of weird. I'm a bit starstruck because every time I see him, he's on the telly. And he's one of the people on the television that I always listen to. He always makes me think. More in Common UK is an increasingly influential and certainly invaluable public opinion research organisation that works to shine a light on what the public really thinks on topics as diverse as immigration, climate change, gender identity, mental health. And their emphasis is on nuance and complexity. Also, he's got a political background. He was once a special advisor to Nicky Morgan and was director of strategy at Ofsted. And it's the first time speaking about ideas. I'm delighted to have him here. So that's great, Luke. We then got Tina Stahl, who is Baroness Stahl, who chairs the Communication and Digital Select Committee at the House of Lords, although she's here because she's one of the most interesting members of the House of Lords, not because of her title. She's a former cabinet minister and leader of the House of Lords. She spent 10 years at the BBC, was chair of the Charity Commission. But as I said, she's one of the most interesting voices in the chamber, in the other place. And you can follow her on Twitter or X to see the kind of work that she gets into. She's always trying to dig beneath the headline. Then we've got Josh Simons, who is a new Labour MP for Makerfield, former director of Labour Together, Britain's biggest political think tank. Josh is also an expert in data, technology, and public services, and his recent book is Algorithms for the People, Democracy in the Age of AI. And I'd like to commend Josh for speaking here because I think it's very important that our new MPs actually get out there and engage with the public. And as soon as I asked Josh, he said yes. And that takes some doing because a lot of people, when I ask them, run the other way. But hopefully he'll have a good time here. We've then got Anne-Elizabeth Moutet. Now, she is a columnist and commentator for The Telegraph, Unheard, GB News, BFM TV in Paris, one of my favourite European commentators. Her coverage and analysis of the recent French elections was really totally spot on, but also invaluable, helped me untangle all of the ins and outs of it. And her most recent book was a collective work, Illiberalism in Europe, which seems very appropriate as a theme for what we're discussing here today. So I'm delighted she's come from France to speak today. And then finally, Professor Frank Furedi, a sociologist and social commentator, post-academic life. He's making real waves in his role as executive director of MCC Brussels, the author of over 25 books, including many that are invaluable guides in relation to democracy. But his most recent is The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. And Frank is one of our advisors and a regular at the Battle of Ideas. But what a panel, eh? Give him a round warm of applause. Okay, to kick us off then, Luke.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Cloud. It's great to be invited. Unfortunately, what I'm going to say, I don't think I'm going to provide you with the reassurance that you were looking for. I was rewatching the Lord of the Rings trilogies recently, that great Peter Jackson production. And there's a line in there, bear with me, this does link to democracy. There's a line in there where Saruman the wizard says to Gandalf, "The hour is later than you think." And I think that is where we are when it comes to the state of our democracy. And I'm going to give you three figures which hopefully hammer that point home. They are 31%, 76%, and 62%. Just 31% of the UK public think that democracy is working at the moment. 76% of the public think that the system is rigged towards the rich and influential. And I think most damning of all, 62% of the public don't think that our politicians are up to dealing with the big challenges that our country faces. All in all, there is a deep and pervasive unhappiness with the status quo. And throughout the election campaign, I ran around 50 focus groups. And when I tell you, it was sometimes like being hit by a battering ram of disillusionment. I'm not exaggerating. The public were deeply unhappy, not just with the outgoing government, but with the system itself, which they felt was letting them down. And I think what was so striking and what bears stressing is it wasn't just one group in the public. So I could be speaking to voters in what's become known as the Red Wall in the north of England, in the Midlands, and they would tell me how disappointed they were that promises on levelling up hadn't been kept. But I could also speak to Muslim voters in Birmingham who would tell me how neglected they felt by the Labour Party, the fact that they hadn't been listened to. You could speak to inner city young professionals who thought, I've done the right thing. I've gone and, I've got a degree. I've worked hard. I've paid all of this money in. And yet I'm in my 30s and I'm still having to share a house with 4 other people. You'd even speak to, people in Surrey in those leafy blue wall seats who would like, something's just not quite right. Although I have to say my empathy slightly drained with the guy who said, and I haven't even been able to turn my hot tub on all summer because of the cost of living crisis. But, everyone experiences this in their own way. And what that led to in this election, I think it's important not to see what happened in July as a standalone event, but actually as the third part of a trilogy. And that trilogy was in 2016, the public voted for Brexit. In 2019, they voted to get Brexit done. And in 2024, they voted to get the buggers out. And in each of those elections, the common theme was that the public was saying, we're not happy. We think some quite radical change needs to happen. And when I talk about getting the buggers out, it wasn't just the Tories. In fact, the biggest predictor at that election of you losing vote share was being an incumbent. So incumbent MPs, whether they were Conservatives, whether they were in the SNP or in Labour, all in aggregate lost vote share as people went to the smaller parties. Now, there's one world in which people going to smaller parties, having more choice on offer is a good thing. But that wasn't what was motivating, right? People weren't going to smaller parties because, well, it's great. I can vote for a Green Party now. I can vote for Reform UK. I can vote for an independent. They were doing it as a symbol of protest. And what's interesting is if you look at that unhappiness, that unease, it is just transferred to after the election, right? I think there were some people who were expecting that when the election happened, and as some people put it, you may agree or disagree with them, there were grown-ups back in the room, as it was put, that things would be different. But they're not. It's not different. If you look at our latest polling, Keir Starmer's approval rating has fallen by 50 points since July. In our last poll, the Conservatives and Labour were tied. That wasn't a result of some great triumph on the part of the Conservatives, who are still at 27%. The two main parties were getting 54% of the vote between them. 2017, it was 84%. So something has changed very quickly, very rapidly. Reform UK now on 21% in our polling. But I think it's clear that the new government has made some early missteps, and we can debate what those missteps might be, whether it is the freebies, the winter fuel allowance, the tone of gloom. But actually, if you look at what has happened, even given that fall is so quick, and it's because I think we've heard a lot, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot in the run-up to the budget, about the financial black hole that they did or didn't inherit from the last government. I think what's less talked about is the trust black hole that they inherited. And what that means is that people are just not willing to give politicians the degree of slack that they might have done in the past. And what we get from our focus groups is people have seen things like the freebies, or they've seen the decision on winter fuel allowance, and they're basically going, oh my God, it's just going to be more of the same, isn't it? We're not going to get that change that we thought we were getting. So what might the panel want to talk about doing? I'm conscious I've got about 30 seconds left. I think my job was just to set the scene and leave the answers to others. But I think there are 5 things that need to change, and I'll just canter through them very quickly. 1, the public just need to feel less exhausted. We need to get out of this sense of perma-crisis that has persisted basically since the financial crash in 2008. They need to feel like everyday life is less of a struggle, that getting a GP appointment isn't like trying to complete the Hunger Games. They need to feel that politicians respect them, and that respect isn't about having a degree or living in London or being wealthy, but about your contribution to society. And if there's one thing I can leave you with, is that link seems to have been broken to the public between contribution, what you put in, and what you get out. And the number of times I hear from people, and this is where I'll end, I work hard, I do my bit, and I've got nothing to show for it at the end of the month. And until you tackle that, our democracy is going to struggle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That was an excellent scene setter, and actually dug deeply into the question rather than just superficially. So I think great start. Tina.
Thank you, Claire. And I think a lot of what I'm going to say will echo and complement what we just heard from Luke, which is clearly not very encouraging. However, there is one aspect of democracy which does give me some hope, which is that I think since 2016, what voters have discovered is the power of their vote in terms of forcing disruption and upending the status quo. We've seen that the surprise and the shock through the result of 2016, also the general election in 2017, as well as what Luke referred to in 2019 and this year. We are now in an era where there is no such thing as a safe seat. The problem, I think, is that those of us in the political class don't understand that we are the problem when it comes to the way people feel about democracy. And that's because we seem to be either willfully misunderstanding or resisting understanding what it is and the scale of change and improvement that the voters want from us. Now, I think there's always been a healthy cynicism about politicians. But for me, this current wave of disaffection started in 2008 with the financial crash, because what that exposed then was what people had suspected for too long, that those who claimed to have superior knowledge were not as clever as they thought they were after all. Because whilst in the past, a sort of sense of superiority, if you like, from the ruling classes was tolerated. It was tolerated because the social contract was one that seemed to work okay. After 2008, it became apparent that not only was it not working, but the people who had claimed this new approach, whether you want to call it globalization or not, was not working to anybody's advantage apart from those who seem to be making all of the decisions. And in saying that, by the way, I'm not arguing against. I don't think you can defeat globalization, as it were. I think it's just the way in which it was advanced and the complete disregard and denial of the impacts on different parts of society and an unwillingness to introduce mitigations. Once we then got into the expensive scandal of 2009, that made matters worse because then people also had proof in terms of what they'd long thought about politicians being in it for themselves. Now, the reason why I rehearsed some of this background is because, as Claire said in her introduction, we are living in an increasingly complex world. And what is going to be necessary if politicians or business leaders are going to come forward with complex solutions to these complex problems is for them to be trusted, because people aren't going to understand a lot of the technological shifts, and they can only trust people if they feel that through our actions and our decisions we have demonstrated we share and understand common concerns and common values. And that's what we have failed to do sufficiently in that period since 2008. And when it got to 2016, what the referendum presented was an opportunity for people to actually, if you like, that all of the villains as they saw them were sort of lined up on one side, and it was possible to vote against them and actually make a difference. And as we've heard from Luke, since then, I think we as politicians have made things worse by doing things like campaigning for a second referendum on Europe. The initial support there was for the Extinction Rebellion's serious disruption, because this seemed to be tolerated because people thought it was all in a good cause. There was the inconsistent tolerance and application of the rules during COVID, depending on which issues people were protesting about. We've had Parliament's ongoing dilution and frustration of any new laws to deal with preventing illegal immigration or limiting legal migration. And the way in which politicians have dealt with that has been almost with a sense of distaste for what it is that the majority have been wanting. The chaos in my own party and the failure plus removal of a prime minister in whom so many people had vested so much confidence to deliver what they'd voted for, followed by, or indeed preceded by, the zest and glee from some media commentators and the opposition to Boris's character flaws, believing that they were morally superior and that by pointing to his flaws, they were being proved right, that the voters had been wrong to support him and not them. So I think that come earlier this year, the election was clearly a vote of no confidence in the Conservatives, and people were determined to get us out. And as we've heard from Luke, people desperately wanted things to change. But the results themselves in July show that there wasn't a lot of confidence in the kind of change that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party were offering. And I think that, compounded by some of the moral superiority that has come from Keir Starmer in the past, and now being very much undermined by what we've seen with some of his the kind of whole gifts and what have you, is undermining yet further people's confidence. So I think this underlying anxiety continues. I think as far as the riots in the summer were concerned, clearly all decent people would condemn without equivocation the demonstrations, the violence and the hatred. And I think it was good that the Prime Minister and the police were able to bring these things under control. But I think what troubles me was the introduction of describing a lot of this as far right, and far right being a label that was used quite often by the Prime Minister and others during that period. And because far right is such an ill-defined term, and we know that that gets often thrown around when people talk about the Reform Party, and therefore the people who vote for reform think that they are being described as the far right. This kind of conflation of issues when politicians are talking about violence and hatred on the streets versus those who express unacceptable views on social media is causing yet more concern that we are unable to distinguish between acts of violence, unacceptable language, and people's legitimate disaffection with the political class. All of this, I fear, is going to continue to fuel public trust. So I guess in conclusion, and it sort of very much supports what Luke has said, I don't think democracy is in peril because of the voters. I don't even think democracy is in peril because of our electoral system. I'm not actually in favour of changing it. I think what voters have demonstrated is first past the post actually works. What is the reason why democracy is in peril is because of us politicians, and because we are still claiming to be superior to voters. We act in a way which seems to think that we are superior, whilst we are not doing enough through our actions to show we understand where we've gone wrong, and we're not changing our approach in putting things right. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. A refreshingly honest appraisal of where we are. And as we know, that's a rarity amongst politicians. Let's see if Josh can live up to it. Right, Josh.
Well, Tina's slightly less subject to the wit than I am, so she gets a bit of a pass. So I love forums like this. I think ideas are the lifeblood of democracy, and I'm really glad to be part of this, even as an elected MP. I've already seen 3 journalists that I know, so I'm just going to tell you right now, I am not speaking on behalf of the Labour government or the Labour Party. I am an MP. If you really want to twist something that I say and put it in an article, go ahead, but please send it to me first. I would be grateful. I also care very much about the question on the table. In a sense, everything I've done in my life, the 5 years I spent working in the tech sector, writing a book, standing for Parliament myself, trying to reform a think tank in this country that is avowedly and openly political rather than pretending not to be. All of these are, in a sense, about democracy. It's the thing that I care most about. So I want to try and put out an argument to be knocked down rather than give you a kind of history of how we got here. And the argument is this, that this country's democracy is in better health than many of our peers, but this country's state is a miserable, tangled, ineffective mess. And when the state is a miserable, tangled, ineffective mess, it has all sorts of downstream consequences for how democracy works, in particular, that the connection between frustration, voting, replacing the people in power, and seeing change doesn't work. And that connection in this country is not working properly. So what do we need to do to fix democracy? Radically reform the connection between the state and democratic institutions. That's essentially what I'm going to say. So let me just be a little bit more precise about what I mean. Democracy in this, and we don't have to argue about the words, but just so I'm clear about the point I'm making. Democracy, in what I'm saying, is elections. It's the institutions of democracy, it's Parliament. It's, to some extent, the faith that people have, not that democracy will deliver for them, but that they'd rather have democracy than some other form of political system. And that there are worrying trends there, but the vast majority of the British public still believe they'd rather have democracy as opposed to anything else. The state, on the other hand, the point of a state is to give effect in a democracy to the people who have a mandate to effect the change that they promised. That's the point of a state. Why do we all do our jobs in politics? I want to win power. I want to be in the cabinet so that I can control an institution that allows me to effect change in the society. That's the basic structure of how it works. When that institution is broken and it doesn't allow you to do half the things you want to do, it incentivizes risk aversion. It incentivizes avoiding hard choices. It incentivizes short time horizons. And the effect of all of those things is a public that quite rightly, slowly, bit by bit, but surely gets more and more pissed off. Not in one big blow, not in one big sort of dramatic moment, but bit by bit, they begin to think, every time I go to the ballot box and then I change who's in power or I vote on a constitutional question, nothing changes. And that is a deep and serious problem that we must fix. So let me just quickly tell you why I think democracy's here not as bad as it is in some places. Unlike some of my colleagues, I thought Brexit was a constitutional question. It always was. And once the British public had voted, we had to deliver it. That was the bottom line. So I think it is a good thing for democracy that Brexit has happened, and we should not forget that. The last election was a celebration of the median voter. My wife's American. We talk about the differences between our system a lot. You can knock the disparity between the number of seats that Labour got in Parliament and the vote share it got. But what it really means is that political parties in this country are incentivized to ruthlessly focus on the median voter. When those voters decide elections, democracy tends to work better. And the flip side of the same idea is, can you imagine in Congress if the House of Representatives ever had a situation in which the number of seats that just changed hands? Impossible, because they're gerrymandered. And in parliaments all over the world, the number of seats that have just changed hands in the House of Commons is an extraordinary thing, and it is good for democracy. It is about refreshing politicians. It is about energy, lifeblood, injecting it into the core of our parliament, and it is what voters wanted. So that is good too. We are not also socially polarized like some countries are. When we import this language from America of the culture wars, that's not a representation of the vast majority of the British public. When you map, as Luke often does, public opinion across a whole range of moral questions, actually the public are not cemented into two immovable blocks at all. Again, that is a good thing for democracy. However, the bad. And my contention is that all of these bad things are actually at base about the connection between the political institutions of democracy, who has power when they win elections, and the state, what they can actually do with that power, what that power means for citizens. Trust is never lower. People don't think voting makes any difference. They don't think national politics makes any difference to their lives. When I hit the campaign ground in Wigan, one of the things I was struck by is voters not showing out. It's not to do with apathy. It's not because they can't be asked. They've got better things to do. They're angry. They're really angry. They don't think their time is well spent in that ballot box because they don't think it makes any difference. That's a problem. Low turnout is generally often about anger rather than apathy. And now, having been elected, every institution I find in the British state, in some ways, has an unthinking, latent institutional conservatism built into it. And I have no problem with being conservative. I do have a problem when you don't know why. If you think things should be done the same way, and you can't explain why. And everywhere you look, in Parliament, in the House of Commons, in Whitehall, these institutions will not change, but they don't know why. And that's a problem because voters want change, as Tina said. One minor example of this is, why can't we get 650 MPs outside the House of Commons so they can fix the damn building and then go back in 6 years? Why can't we do that? It's so simple, and yet we can't. We cannot make it happen. So here's my contention. Most of these problems are about the weakness and the ineffectiveness of the British state, not about the political institutions and norms that make democracy work. If we get the state working properly, we will fix problems that are often laid at the feet of British democracy. So here's a mad list to end, because I know I've got about a minute and a half. 1 minute, not even a half. Here's a mad list of reforms, of things that we could do. I'm just going to say these and put them out here without any explanation whatsoever. We need fewer site halls in Whitehall. We need way more expertise and way fewer generalists in Whitehall. We need a beefed up centre of the British state, which separates politics and the civil service much more cleanly and empowers those with mandates. Politics has to drive what the civil service does. We need more centralised procurement skills, better use of data. We obviously need to reform judicial review, and I say that as a Labour MP. We need to value public institutions again and build them, an FDR era in which we value the authority and power of a public institution that the public recognise and see themselves in. But we also need to recognise that parliamentary sovereignty is a myth. The people are sovereign. And that has all kinds of implications for our constitution that we need to cash out right the way through them. Sovereignty in practice flows up in this country. That's what we saw with the Scottish referendum, not down. and we should be reforming the British state to reflect that. Local authorities don't work when the elected mandates that people have do not match the powers that councillors actually have to effect the change. There's no connection between what you vote for and what change you want to see. So it's no wonder that about 30% of people only show out. And anybody that is truly devolved has to be able to default. Unless you can borrow money and default, devolution isn't real. So I will stop there. If we did a few of those things, I think you would repair that connection between democracy and the state, and that would do some of the big things that we need to fix democracy.
Thanks, John. So I like that. I think it's always good to have an argument and a thesis, and that kind of distinction with the state and democracy is very important. And then we also like a bit of practical bits at the end. So that was very, very useful, Josh. Thank you very much. And Elizabeth, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. And I must say that listening to the three previous speakers, I'm fascinated by how much the debate actually is framed in the same way in France. And we are a different country. We are a country where, if you look at the title of this panel, elections and riots have always been in lockstep. We glorify the riots, and then we have elections. Yes, so this is not new. But the lack of trust, too, you would think that France wouldn't have the same kind of problem because we are a country where there is little trust. I'm always fascinated by British and especially American society and the level of a horizontal trust that people have in one another, and which they are actually perceiving to be disappearing because the bonds of trust that existed in a recognizable American and British culture seem to be disappearing. But in France, we're a country where your neighbors turn you into the police. And I'm not talking about the 1940, 1945 time. I'm talking about the St. Bartholomew massacre. A great French historian has just written a book about the using all the anonymous letters and all the court cases and the justice investigations and the executions that devolved from people denouncing the neighbors as being secret Protestants. And by the way, I really would like to have his flat or house. So we invented nothing. We're not a country of trust. And still, there was enough trust that when we've lost it, we feel how much we've lost it. And this election, the wonderful, glorious, extraordinary mess that gives me so many opportunities to write, it was all contained in the arrival of Emmanuel Macron. And Emmanuel Macron seemed to be the dream, the French dream. The French dream is somebody who comes from the deep state, has, aced those exams and those competitive, the sort of concours that you have to pass in order to be acceptable in polite society in Paris. And so we had somebody who was both outside, a disruptor, somebody nobody knew, but we could trust him because he came from the state. And he was our Brexit vote in so many ways. Here is this man who in 2016 says, I want to be president. And in 2017, he's elected president. And he's got this sort of crazy and hysterical campaign, 200,000 people volunteer happily and sort of, canvass people, go door to door. And I'll remind you, we're not a trust country. So this is a very new thing. So what people were doing, I didn't vote for him because I'm a wily old bird, and I thought, yes, this is too shiny. I don't believe in it. But people voted because, like you said, they wanted to kick the bastards out, and they were all aligned. The socialist, he was part of a socialist government, and they were, the hit between the eyes. François Hollande, the socialist president, did not even run again. And the right was said to be sort of old people. And then he said, I can do en même temps, at the same time. I can take the best from the left, I can take the best from the right, and we can make something different. And of course he didn't. That the style was entirely different. It was incredibly even more top down. You had this man who was popular and sort of, shaking hands in this wonderful campaign. And when he's inaugurated, the first thing he does is he speaks in the courtyard of the Louvre Museum at a high days. And he's separated from the crowd by 100 meters, which he walks alone. I mean, you cannot more figure somebody as being the king. And then just, in case we didn't miss the reference, he said, the French want a Jupiterian president. I am Jupiter. And it went downhill from there because it was bound to do. But what happened, and he became unpopular, but still, when he was pitted against Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally, the revamped and renamed National Front, at the last election 2 years ago in 2022, it feels like a century, people looked at her and they thought, I'm not sure she's a fascist, but I'm pretty sure she's incompetent. And that was why she didn't go through. And there were enough people on the left who said, no, what she says is not what I believe in. It's not me. It's not the country. It's not France. It's not the tradition. We're not going to elect somebody whose father so obviously came from unpleasant parts of French society. I've just mentioned them before. And so she failed. And then she plod on, but she's been plodding on. She's been rebranding her party. She's been making it much more acceptable. The Overton window has moved at the same time, where you can now talk about immigration and you still get the ritual insults. But there's also many more possibilities to actually look at the fractures in society, that an immigration that you do not control and that you do not choose, and that you then inflict on people who don't know how they're going to cope with practical things, social services, etc. That is something that has moved. And there's also a feeling of that the French identity is being lost for the same reasons. So what happened at the European elections was the European elections are the only PR vote that we have in France. And therefore what it is, and has been traditionally ever since we started having them, is a life-size poll. And Macron got clobbered because it was easy and it was supposed to have no consequences, really. It was really, we mean it next time. And he looked at it. He had a fit of pique. You have to realize that Emmanuel Macron wanted to be an actor. He really wanted to be a classical actor. And he has acted his presidency in some way. He's performed his presidency. We look deep for sincerity and don't always find it. But he looked at the results. The results were saying, we want you out. And he called a snap election. He had an uncertain house. We have a very different system in France, but he didn't have entirely a majority. So every single major bill had to be passed with alliances, which could happen or could not happen. If not, there is a constitutional disposition in France, Article 49.3 of the French Constitution. I'm sure you're happy to know this, in which the Prime Minister puts the collective responsibility of its cabinet on the line, and if you vote against this bill, then I will, if you do not want it, I will ram through this bill with this article. I will ram through this bill, and if you're not happy, you have to then have a vote of distrust, a lack of trust in my government. But it worked. He passed his pensions reform. And then came this. He called the snap election. The snap election was not necessary from a house in which he lacked 15 to 20 MPs for a majority. He found himself in a house where he had no majority whatsoever, and the country has been divided in three feuding blocks. And those three feuding blocks who didn't have time, and that was entirely Macron's design. He gave them 3 weeks to bring in an election. The National Rally, even not being prepared, came broadly, 11 million votes against 7 million votes for the left and 6 million votes for the Macronist. And in the second round, the other two ganged together and said, this is the anti-fascist front, no pass around. And we're now left in the situation where there is no trust. There is a cabinet that comes from the weakest party in the House, people who've got 48 MPs when the left front have got 190 and the right has the National Front have got National Rally have got 140 and Macron's people have got 110 or something. It is essentially a mess. My figures are not entirely accurate, but that's the proportion. And we don't know what we're facing, but we are facing this in a country where you talked about the state, the importance of the state. The importance of the state has been the Constitution of France, so we do not trust our state any more than you do. And therefore, I will end because I'm over my time, but we are coming from a different way of doing politics, but we are facing exactly the same thing that Britain is.
Thank you very much.
I think it is very important, and which is why I'm so delighted that you've just spoken in that way. It is very important for us in the UK, As people may or may not know, I'm rather pleased that we left the European Union, but that's not to suggest that one isn't interested in the world or part of the world, and knowing what's happening in Europe and seeing what's happening around the world is essential. And I think that example about what's happening in France gives you a sense of a more existential moment that we're all facing. Frank has also been involved in international, but you finish off the conversation, right?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about Europe, as I am about Britain, precisely because what people call the problem of trust is actually when the little boy tells the emperor, you got no clothes, and basically says you're a bunch of bullshitters. And finally comes to the conclusion that perhaps there's going to be an answer that isn't relying upon elected professional politicians solving their problem. And I think that's a positive thing. I don't think it's possible to discuss the problem of democracy if we accept the way it's presented. Because almost everything you hear in the media about democracy and its problems is seen through the prism of a very small section of society. It's a bit like when you listen to the BBC Today program or all the people that are associated with that. They have a particular vision. So from their point of view, democracy works really, really well when the debate is really about fairly limited, narrow issues. So, for example, democracy is okay if you have very furious debates about taxation. Democracy is really brilliant when Parliament really gets involved in a discussion of MPs, sort of expenses. Things are really fine if the discussion is about urban planning, all that kind of technical stuff. But the minute you raise issues that go way beyond the normal, boring stuff that Parliament is very passionate about, that is seen as somehow extreme. That is seen somehow as radicalizing, populist even. And I think that it's quite important to realize that when people talk about democracy being under pressure now, which I think is a good thing, is because a lot of people are not satisfied with merely having a furious debate about how many percentage that tax is going to go up by. But there are other questions that excite the imagination. In the world we live in, people look around their everyday life and they see it's changing, not always to the good. It's changing not because they were participant in bringing that change about, but because this is something that has happened to them. So I think that's important to realize. People are struggling for a voice in Europe as they are here. I think that's a wonderful development. For example, I live in Faversham, a small Kentish town. We had a by-election last week in one of our wards, which has always voted for Labour. And yet, we had an election where the person that won the vote was from the Lib Dems. Reform came second, Conservatives came third, and Labour came fourth. And what people were doing there was experimenting. They were involved in a political experimentation where they're looking for some solutions to their problems. They don't know what party is good, what party is bad. But the very fact that they understand that the automatic voting in the old way, at least to that end, I think was really, really very, very good. I think that for us, if we want to take democracy seriously in the years ahead, we're going to challenge the language in which it's formed and its problems are represented. So, for example, just listen to the words they use. If you don't vote for a mainstream party, if you happen to be somebody that doesn't vote for Labour or the Tories, it's invariably called a protest vote. Have you ever heard that expression? It's just a protest vote, right? As if somehow that's kind of morally inferior to a non-protest vote. Not realizing that when people make a decision to vote in a particular kind of a way that rejects the pre-existing mainstream, they're actually making a fairly brave decision. They're saying enough is enough. They may not know exactly what kind of world they want to build, but they know that what they certainly do not want is more of the same. And very often these protests, and Brexit was a very good example of that, these idiots are just protesting against something. They don't know what they're doing, what they are in for. Not realizing that actually it's got a liberating impulse that is behind it, that at some point can lead to a transcendence from the existing rigid technocratic status quo. If you're a populist, right? If for some reason you see yourself as a populist, and these days it's very difficult to self-identify as a populist because you get shut down as far right or fascist or whatever. If you're a populist, then you are divisive. I mean, the two words go hand in hand. Populism and divisiveness go hand in hand, as if there's something wrong with being divisive. I mean, people forget that when democracy was forged in ancient Athens, it was one of the most sort of argumentative society in human history. It was a risk-taking, argumentative society, and being divisive and political divisions were understood as not a problem, but as a good thing, as a prelude to coming to some kind of clarity and clarification. And just down the line, when you look at the language, basically what it's saying is that democracy is what existed in the post-war era, the 50s and the 60s. That's democracy. And the more we get away from the old-fashioned political system, that's a problem, right? And you have to remember that in the 50s and 60s, both the Tories and the Labour argued very often that apathy was a very good thing. That apathy meant that there was less pressure upon the political class. And what is really, to me, quite interesting is that the political classes in Europe and Britain do not actually look in the mirror and ask about their own role within society. It doesn't really ask the question, are we really up to the job? And I think that one of the things that I'm doing a research project on this with my team in Brussels is, why is the political class so incompetent? Why can't they build things? Why can't they deliver? I mean, poor old Roosevelt in the New Deal managed to build the Hoover Dam, in an extremely speedy, fast car. Why can't we do something like that? And actually, there are a number of reasons for that, but the most important thing about the political class is they're incompetent. The kind of people we have in Parliament in the old days would have been parish councillors. If parish councillors, I don't think they would have been members of Parliament, and certainly the political parties no longer train and educate the future members of Parliament to be independent, intellectually courageous individuals. That basically means that if you look at Parliament, who's there, you're not exactly God's gift to political life, right? If you accept
It doesn't mean Josh.
I was waiting for that, Frank.
Yeah, there are exceptions, thankfully. So this is something that I think we got to bear in mind. We got to get away from a political class whose main characteristic towards people in everyday life is one of caring contempt. That sense of caring contempt that you hear on Radio 4 all the time, and from politicians, is a kind of sordid form of elitism that they themselves are not aware of, but they are simply unsympathetic to the predicament that most people are confronted with. So look, democracy is by definition always in trouble. And the reason why it's always in trouble is because it's a contract between the demos, the people, and the institutions. And that's always not going to be easy to work out and easy to sort out. And therefore, I think that, for us, what's really important is not so much just the institutions, although the institutions are important, but also the whole culture of democracy itself. I remember being in a debate in Amsterdam where I argued that I would rather lose an election, but lose it democratically, than win an election by essentially ignoring democratic norms. And this guy came up to me afterward and says, Professor Furedi, so you actually believe that democracy is good and in and of itself? And I thought, yes, I think democracy is a good in and of itself, but it is something that we got to live a little bit more than we're doing at the moment. And I think the challenge for us here in British society is to actually cultivate a culture of democracy and take democracy seriously, and take arguments, debate, and yes, divisiveness and polarization, take it on board and embrace it, instead of trying to pathologize those individuals that raise important and big questions. Allow the populace to have a voice. Allow the people to find their own voice. And instead of there being two-tier policing and two-tier judiciaries, which seek to silence people who say uncomfortable things, let everybody have their voice and let 1,000 flowers bloom.
And thanks very much, Frank.